Good morning. Welcome to First Parish Church in Billerica, a Unitarian Universalist welcoming congregation. Whoever you are or wherever you're on life's journey, you're welcome here this morning. And unfortunately, we can't have coffee hour, but we can chat a little outdoors after the service. This is our second in-person service, or hybrid, really. We're online as well, so we're still ironing out the kinks. My name is Brita. I'm going to be the worship assistant for today's service. And our worship leader this morning is Joshua Leach. He is a public policy and communication strategist at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, a human rights organization inspired by UU values. He holds a Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School and is a candidate for ordination as a UU minister. He's preached for us before. He's just wonderful and is up doing wonderful things. And we're so happy to have him with us here this morning. Are there any announcements? Anybody? Jim? Okay. Let's see, Barbara. Nothing, Barbara? Amazing. Okay, I guess not. In that case, we have a new, since the Indigenous Peoples Service, we actually want to start with a land acknowledgement about the land the church is built on. We would like to begin by acknowledging that our church is built on the unceded traditional territory of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts people. We also acknowledge the physical and spiritual connection that they have continued to maintain with their land here in this place we call Billerica. We recognize the hardships they continue to endure and commit ourselves to learning about our Indigenous neighbors and to fostering good relationships with them. And here are our opening words.
Thanks so much, Brita. Thank you all for being here and for joining us remotely. And thanks to everyone who's made it possible to be back here together in person with our new social distancing measures in place. Our opening words are from the Buddhist tradition. I don't need this at the moment. These words are called boundless goodwill. They're from the Metta Sutta. Let us cultivate boundless goodwill. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none in anger or ill wish will another harm. Even as a mother watches over her child, so with boundless mind should one cherish all living beings, radiating friendliness over the whole world, above, below, and all around without limit. Please join me in the words of our chalice lighting, which can be found in your order of service. Life is a gift for which we are grateful. We gather in community to celebrate the glories and the mysteries of this great gift. Our opening hymn will be The Leaf Unfurling. Due to our social distancing requirements, we will not be singing the hymn aloud, but I invite you to turn to the words in your hymnal, which is number 7, and you'll see that these hymns invite us to contemplate new life unfolding in many forms. I invite you now to join me in the affirmation of faith, the words of which will also be found in your order of service or online. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. We'll now have our candles of joy and concern. Thank you so much, Joa, for that really beautiful piece. I believe that is an original composition of your own, if I have that right. So thank you. Really a treat for us to hear that. For our reading today, I wanted to share a piece by the English poet Stephen Spender. He was mostly known for his politically conscious verse during the 1930s and 40s. And living and writing during that era as he was witness to a number of really disturbing developments around the world. The Second World War, the Holocaust, the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany, the use of atomic weapons and incendiary bombs against civilian populations. So this poem, which I'm about to read, comes from later in his career, and it's about the experience of being a parent or a caregiver of a small child in the wake of these experiences, bringing life into a world that is haunted by these dangers and these tragic events. The poem is called Nocturne. Their 6-week-old daughter lies in her cot, crying out the night. Their hearts are sprung like armies, waiting to cross the gap to where her loneliness lies infinite between them. This child's cry sends rays of a star's pain through endless dark, and the sole purpose of their loving is to disprove her demonstration of all love's aidlessness. Words unspoken out of her mouth unsaying prove unhappiness, pure as innocence, virgin of tragedy, unknowing reason. Star on star of pain surround her cry to make a constellation where human tears of victims are the same as griefs of the unconscious animals. Listening, the parents know this primal cry out of the gates of life hollows an emptiness that proves men's aims should be all times to fill the gap of pain with consolation. poured from the mountain-sided adult lives, whose minds like peaks attain to heights of snow. The snow should stoop to wash away such grief. Unceasing love should lave the feet of victims. Yet, when they lift their heads out of such truths, today mocks at their prayers. To think this even suffices to remind them of far worse, man-made, man-destroying ills which threaten while they try to lull a child. For she who cries for milk, for rocking and a shawl is also subject to the rage of causes dividing peoples. Even at this moment, eyes might fly between them and the moon, and a hand touch a lever to let fall that which would make the street of begging roofs pulverize and creep skywards in a tower. Down would fall baby, cradle, and them all. That which sent out the pilot to destroy them was the same will as that with which they send an enemy to kill their enemy. Even in this love, running in shoals on each side of her bed is fear and hate. If they shift their glances from her who weeps, their eyes meet other eyes, willed with death, also theirs. All would destroy newborn, innocent streets. Necessity with abstract head and searing feet, men's God, unseeing the poor amulets of flesh, unhearing the minutiae of prayer. Parents like mountains watching above their child, invalied here beneath them, also hurled upon their frozen heights, the will that sends destruction into centers of the stones, which concentrated, locked centennial stillness for human generations to indwell. Hearing their daughters cry, which is the speech of indistinguishable primal life. They know the dark is filled with means which are men's plots to murder children. They know too that no cause is just unless it guards the innocent as sacred trust. No truth but that which reckons this child's tears an argument. I invite you now to join me in a silent moment of meditation to reflect on the words of this poem, on the young people in your life, the children or grandchildren you have known or raised. I invite you to reflect on what you would do to keep them safe in a world that is full of dangers. Our second hymn in this service is one you may know well. It's number 409, Sleep, My Child. Again, we won't be singing, but I invite you to follow along with the words and hum if you like. This sermon is called Crying Uncle. My whole life, I've never known if I was what people call good with kids. There never really was an occasion to put this to the test. I was the youngest sibling in my family, the youngest cousin in our extended family. Most days I feel I'm the youngest everything, and it still seems unnatural that the older I get, the more humans there are on the planet who are in fact younger than me. I had nothing against kids, but I didn't see myself becoming a parent or spending a lot of my adult life in their company. It was a source of some anxiety to me, therefore, when I found out I was going to become an uncle. Excitement too, for sure, but when I learned my nephew was on the way, but tinged with anxiety. What if he hates me? I thought. What will he and I talk about? Then I remembered that for a good period at the beginning, he wouldn't be talking at all, and I was even more at a loss. I had my fair share of parlor tricks that I thought or hoped might entertain a small child. I could and can still recite every line from memory of the original Star Wars trilogy in all the voices. I can gargle Christmas carols. I have even penned a Jabberwocky-esque epic of nonsense verse with a satisfying moral at the end called Bibulus and Scribulus and the Odoriferous Slosh. But going too far down this path posed a peril even greater than that of simply not being good with kids. The opposite danger of trying too hard. A line in the book instead of a letter, a moving personal memoir about childlessness by the British writer and editor Diana Athill, stopped me cold when I read it. Speaking of her own emotionally distant father, she observes, "We thought him clever when he made up nonsense verses for us." Oh God, that's me, I thought. But that was as far as their relationship ever went. She contrasts her father's stiffness and forced jocularity with the natural ease she saw in other fathers. Quote, "I sometimes watch my brother handling 3 small sons," she writes, "and I see exactly what it was that my father could not feel. My brother will throw his boys about, stand by a window to watch them play in the garden with an unconscious smile of pure pleasure in his face. He loves them with a comfortable animal warmth, and they respond to it like crocuses in the sun. I very much wanted to be that brother, but I dreaded that I would prove to be more like Athill's father when the time came to put it to the test. And that time arrived in a bigger way than I could have anticipated. In March 2020, all of our lives were upended. My sister was already several months pregnant when the global pandemic seemed to throw the whole world into turmoil. She and her husband were living about an hour's drive away in Rhode Island, and I was in Massachusetts to be close to work. On March 12th, though, our office at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, like so many others, made the decision to go remote. I didn't much fancy living alone and trapped indoors for the next indefinite number of months. In those early days of the pandemic, we had no idea how long this all might last or how much society might unravel. My sister called me. "Just bring whatever soap or hand sanitizer you still have in the house and get down here," she said. I packed my life into a suitcase and headed to Providence, convinced that Massachusetts state troopers were about to seal off the highways behind me at any moment. For the next 3 months and intermittently since, we barricaded ourselves inside, forming a 3.5-person quarantine bubble. My sister spent the final trimester of her pregnancy under coronavirus lockdown, and my nephew came into being in a world that had changed, perhaps permanently, from the one we'd known before. Our 3.5-person bubble then became 4, and I got much more of a crash course in pandemic era uncling than I'd bargained for. Being with my nephew 24/7 over the many months after he was born, I quickly learned a few key things about childcare. The first is that if you thought you had to be entertaining, you quickly realize that more baseline goals are in order. All the nonsense verse in the world will, in the end, barely get you through one 15-minute interval between naps. The pressing need is not to be fun per se, because food, sleep, and shelter are more urgent considerations. It will be many months still before one's nephew or child climbs high enough in Maslow's hierarchy of needs to expect novelty. And once my own nephew reached that stage, most of what he wanted to do every day was just to practice climbing up and down stairs over and over again. I didn't really have to come up with anything to do or say. He just wanted to show me he could do it. No matter how old you are or what professional life you maintain alongside of child rearing, in short, the presence of the baby perforce reduces one's life to the basics of survival. I wasn't worried anymore about being clever or original. I was just trying to figure out how many more renditions of Baby Shark or Banana Phone it would take to put him to sleep. Also, I realized that being around small kids, you don't particularly have to worry about setting the program of entertainment. It's out of your hands. You basically do what the kid wants to do. I'm still hopeful that at some point when he's older, my nephew will clamor for more of my Chewbacca impression. But the only impersonation skill that was really called upon in the first year of his life was how to imitate a human version of the Snoo, the electric powered rocking machine that gushed and warbled and shook my nephew to sleep each night. There was one memorable occasion that comes to mind a few months after he was born. I was in the upstairs guest room getting ready for bed when I heard the most blood-curdling scream to have ever pierced my ears. With a newborn in the house, I feared the worst. My head was suddenly full of horrible possibilities. I got my sister on the phone from the floor beneath me, and she explained that she had just seen a bat swooping about the eaves of their bedroom. Now, this perhaps shouldn't have come as a complete surprise. My brother-in-law at this point had various half-completed construction projects going on around the house that left gaping holes to the outdoors. And the fact that wild animals might have found their way inside was about as inexplicable as the raccoons in the attic in the memorable documentary Grey Gardens. Moreover, my brother-in-law had mentioned in passing a few weeks before that he had thought he had seen a dark shape swooping in the hallway one night. But we hoped that this was the sort of portent that, if ignored, would eventually go away. But no, there was no denying it now. There was a bat inside, and this amounted by order of the state health authorities to enough of a close contact that we needed to go to the hospital to get a rabies vaccine. My nephew, understandably, was not pleased with anything about this situation. As we were waiting for our appointment in the lobby area of the Rhode Island Children's Hospital, it took all our combined powers of shushing and swaying and bobbing to try to get him back to sleep. At some point, I found myself in full mask and gloves with my infant nephew in my arms, making verbal washing machine sounds and doing ballet-like pliés in the middle of the hospital waiting room, in what I hoped would approximate the experience of being encased in the Snoo. If my fear after reading Athill's description of her father, that is to say, was that in the presence of small children, I might be over-rehearsed and self-conscious, that concern, at least, was by this point disproved. If there's one thing childcare did for me very quickly, it was to eliminate any lingering trace of shame. The other thing I quickly realized is that the whole question of bonding, that comfortable animal warmth that Diana Athill talks about, is not something that needs to be analyzed or willed into being. It just sort of happens. Kids bond with, attach in the psychological lingo, to adult caregivers in the simple course of things. And the process is quickly taken outside of conscious control. An example, I'm sitting on the sofa trying to answer a single work email on my phone. My nephew comes over and grabs me around both knees. "Just a minute, Charlie," I say. He nudges the phone away. I frown and he smiles up at me. A transformation is effected. "The email can wait." He implants the thought in my brain. He needs something from me. Maybe it's just food. Maybe he wants to eat my iPhone. Maybe he wants to eat me. But whatever the case, he has a survival need and he sees me as the only one who, in this moment, can remedy it. There's a biological compulsion that kicks into my brain that's simply inarguable. Must feed him, I think. Must make sure he is okay. After months of living this way, I started to notice that I experienced the world differently. Stories in the news or at work where something bad had happened to a family or to a small child gripped me in a new way, upset me at a deeper level. I talked to my sister about this. "Oh," she said, "so your brain has been broken too." The warpage of my mental state only became more manifest in the months ahead. In all my years on this earth, I'd never before noticed or paid any attention to other kids on the street. But here one day, I'm leaving my apartment to hop in the car, and I see my neighbor playing in the street with his infant son, who's wheeling himself about in a plastic carrier. My head is suddenly scanning the environment for every possible hazard that could threaten the life of the toddler. It's like a knife into my heart. I realize then that my nephew, however innocently and unwittingly, has placed great chains upon my life. I'm no longer free. I'll never again be able to go through the world without feeling responsible for the well-being of random children. I tell you all of this, not just because it changed something in me, but because more specifically, it changed how I feel about my work at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. This work had become personal in a way it wasn't quite before. Now, I had been working on immigration-related advocacy for UUSC throughout all 4 years of the Trump presidency, including during the implementation of the so-called family separation policy. We had partners working at the border at the time who saw the effects of this policy directly. Children were being taken from their parents' arms, with their only adult caregivers being deported in some cases across multiple national boundaries. Many of these families have still not been reunited 3 years later due to various bureaucratic delays. Some of the children have been apart from their parents for so long by this point that they've lost the ability to speak with their parents in their native language. I knew enough at the time all this was happening to grasp intellectually the horror of it, a violation of the most basic of human rights, both to seek asylum and to form a family of one's choosing. But I didn't realize until my nephew was born and came into the world quite the immensity of it. I didn't realize what 3 years of enforced separation between a small child and their primary adult caregiver could mean. How critical those early years are, how fundamental the bonds formed during those ages are, and what an inconceivable act of violence it takes to rip them asunder. Nor is family separation just a matter for a historical reckoning, a wrong from the recent past for which our government must atone. I wish I could say it was, but I can't. The Biden administration, despite their plans to restore dignity and humanity to US border policies, continues to inflict policies that separate children from their loved ones. They may not be tearing kids from mothers and fathers' arms the way Trump was, but they are tearing them from the arms of aunts and uncles, which is scarcely much better. And so UUSC's and our partners' advocacy work to end these policies continues. The way in which extended families are often separated at the border is not very well known. It's not as notorious as Trump's family separation policy, but it is real nonetheless. Under a practice that long predates Trump and that has continued after him, the US government routinely separates children who are encountered at the border from any adults they're traveling with, so long as the latter can't establish that they're legal guardians. This often includes grandparents, older siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles. The kids are then legally categorized as unaccompanied, meaning they're housed by a different agency than the adults they traveled with. Then the enforcement agencies often process and deport the adults with whom they originally crossed the border. Now, this separation is no doubt traumatic for many children who cross the border with trusted adult relatives, but the government argues it's a necessary step. They say they need to do this in order to screen against the risk of human trafficking. And in the past, at least, they could say that the separation was in most cases temporary, and they would have been right. Under the old rules, the other adult relatives could eventually hope to get released from detention and pursue their asylum case in an immigration court, provided they could show a credible fear of persecution in their home countries. This release would then allow them to serve as sponsors for unaccompanied children with whom they originally crossed the border, thus enabling that family to reunite with one another. But a policy known as Title 42 changed all of that. Starting in March of 2020, the Trump administration began enforcing a new set of rules, one they had invented, although they cloaked it in a decades-old public health law that had never before been used in this way to deny asylum. According to this new policy, anyone who was caught crossing the border, regardless of their need for humanitarian protection or the dangers they faced at home, could be summarily expelled from the country without a chance to seek asylum. This meant no interview to establish their credible fear of persecution, no chance to press their claim for protection before an immigration judge. Unaccompanied children, meanwhile, have been exempt from the policy under the Biden administration, which is the right call. But to this president's disgrace, he has continued to enforce the larger Title 42 order against adults. The result of this is that once extended families are separated from one another at the border, as we described above, the children are then labeled unaccompanied, even if they came with adult caregivers. Then the aunt or uncle they traveled with, or whoever else it might be, grandparents or cousins, and who may be the only trusted adult they know in the country, is expelled from the border with no chance to seek asylum. UUSC heard from our partners at the border about this policy before it was widely discussed elsewhere. Many of my waking and working hours since have been devoted to trying to bring the full atrocious effects of this Title 42 policy to wider attention. For as I've tried to explain in this sermon, this is more than just a professional issue for me now. The separation of adults and uncles from their nieces and nephews under Title 42 has attained a special poignancy for me. As an uncle who has been at times a major caregiver in his nephew's life, I know these bonds are profound, that a separation between any caregiver and child, whether they're formally legal guardians or not, is a trauma, particularly when it involves potentially permanent expulsion across borders. The reporter Adolfo Flores recounts the story of one such separation that happened in May of this year under the Biden administration because of Title 42. Quote, immediately after landing on the banks of the Rio Grande in Roma, Texas, Herbert promised his crying 4-year-old nephew that he would never leave him. But days later, inside a Border Patrol facility, he was forced to break that vow. I have nothing against you, Herbert said, a young Border Patrol agent told him, but the child is going to a shelter and you are going back to Mexico. Herbert explained, I couldn't take my nephew with me because I'm just his uncle, but I also don't know that we will ever recover from that experience, end quote. I can't help but see myself in Herbert and my nephew in his own. And it helps me understand at a new level that my rights are their rights. Their safety and well-being and liberation are bound up with my own. This is what the human rights movement is all about, building on the threads of commonality and empathy that give us our shared humanity. I'll never forget a story I once heard from the great religious leader and human rights advocate, Sister Simone Campbell. She described a politician she knew who had spent much of his career sponsoring anti-immigrant legislation, measures to deny undocumented immigrants driver's license, to deputize more state and local law officials to conduct federal immigration arrests, transferring people to ICE custody and ejecting them from the country. But at a certain stage of his career, this politician underwent a profound conversion. He abandoned all of these laws. He stopped using anti-immigrant rhetoric to drum up votes. She asked him what had changed. He said, my son was born. As soon as I held him in my arms, I realized I would do anything to keep him safe. And I couldn't blame anyone who would cross a border to do the same for their families. Not every politician who currently wants to expel immigrants or separate families will be changed in this way. But if there's any hope for human rights or for the Unitarian Universalist values with which they're entwined, I find it here. Whoever we are, whatever our life experiences have been, we all know the feeling of having someone who is precious to us, whose happiness is more important to us than our own, When we imagine what we would do for the sake of that person's life or safety, we can perhaps gain some insight into why people brave unimaginably dangerous journeys across land and sea to apply for asylum here in the United States. This shared recognition of humanity must be the starting point for our advocacy. We have the power and the privilege as members of this society to make our voices heard. At UUSC, we're working to revoke the Title 42 policy, and each and every one of us here can contact our representatives and let them know that we support strong asylum protections. We don't have to be bystanders to cruelty and injustice. We can construct a better, freer, and more just world, founded in the inherent worth and dignity that we hold in common as members of this larger human family. I want to close with the words from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that really ground this principle in the larger framework of human rights that UUSC seeks to advance. Among the many human rights that it recognizes and protected, there's one in Article 16. It says the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society, and it is entitled to protection by society and the state. That is the principle we're called to uphold now. We'll have our offering.
Thank you for that wonderful sermon. Our Unitarian Universalist churches are self-supporting. Your gifts of time, faith, love, and of money is what sustains the work of the church. The morning's offering will now be taken and gratefully accepted.
We'll now listen to our final hymn of the service, number 163, For the Earth, Forever Turning.
For
I invite you to join me in our words as we extinguish the chalice together. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. For our closing and final words, I just want to remind us of how Stephen Spender ends his poem, which we used as our reading. Hearing their daughters cry, he writes, which is the speech of indistinguishable primal life. They know that the dark is filled with means which are men's plots to murder children. They know too that no cause is just unless it guards the innocent as sacred trust. No truth but that which reckons this child's tears an argument. May we remember that.